And we actually did that in two separate sections. We looked at the regular limits that we calculated, and then we also looked at infinite limits, and we calculated limits algebraically. And Nick, we addressed your question a little bit about the infinite limits, about what needs to be shown for those. So calculating limits algebraically, both regular and infinite. You might have this question of, well, when we're calculating limits algebraically, the very first day that we looked at limits algebraically, I had you working with those limit laws and justifying every single step that you went along in your calculating your limit algebraically. And what you might have noticed if you've taken a look at homework number 3 is that question number 1 on there is to justify every step by using those limit laws. So when it comes to the exam, you're not going to need to justify your steps with those limit laws. Okay? Those limit laws, I gave that to you as a homework problem so you can work through that and take the time to do every single one of those steps very carefully. But when it comes to our exam, you will have some regular limits to calculate, but you won't have to justify those steps with your limit laws on the exam. Okay? That being said, you want to keep those laws in your mind so that when you're calculating your limit algebraically, you're still doing stuff legitimately. Okay, questions or comments about the calculations?
Provide a list of the limit laws?
I will not be providing a list of the limit laws because I won't ask you to specifically reference them. So you'll want to know them, but you won't need to know the numbers, and I will not provide them. Okay, so other things that you might have besides calculations on this exam, you might have some graphical interpretations. So things such as finding limits by looking at a graph, and things such as interpreting what a graph is saying. And what I mean by that is things like our examples on day 1 when we were talking about the boy raising the flag. Can you describe what's happening in a particular situation, like our flag raising graphs? Areas where I might ask you to literally regurgitate a specific definition. I may ask you to state the definition of continuous at a number. So we had a very specific definition of continuous at a number A. And we also had a very specific limit definition of a derivative. Now today we learned about an alternate version of that, the H version. If I ask you to state the limit definition of a derivative, you can state either one, but certainly I wouldn't expect you necessarily to state the H one because we just talked about it today. Okay, so these are the 2 items where I might ask you to specifically regurgitate a statement or a theorem or a definition. And last but not least, the other type of questions that you might expect on this exam are questions that ask you to give an explanation or give an example. So things like in section 1.4, number 10, in the practice problems, and we talked about that specifically in class. Things such as show that a function is or is not continuous at a value of x equal to a using a graph of continuity, of continuous, at x equal to a. So we talked about an example of this in class one day, and you'll notice on your homework number 3 that I'm asking you to show that that particular function is continuous at a particular number, and that was an algebraic version of that. In an example that you might have on an exam, the graph or the function would be a graphical function. Okay, so last 2 things. You might be asked to write down an example using the intermediate value theorem, where the hypothesis fails or is satisfied. And or the conclusion fails or is satisfied. And this is very similar to, say, number 34 in the practice problems. That was section 1.5, I believe, was the continuity section. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, and last but not least might be a question similar to what David asked today, which is draw a picture of a function given very specific requirements. So, draw an example of a graph satisfying certain limit requirements. So things that you'll notice about what I have written up on the board is that there are actually very few calculations on this exam 1. In terms of high priority calculations, calculating limits algebraically seems to be the highest priority of calculations. The rest of what's written up here, there's a lot of interpreting of pictures, a lot of explain or give an example, and where you definitely want to be able to state a particular definition. Okay, any questions about these expectations? Okay, in that case, I guess we'll stop here.